Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. The 2023 Giving Report by Canada Helps begins with a stark headline: "It's time for change." The report goes on to outline alarming challenges facing the nonprofit sector, including unprecedented demand for services, falling donations, staff mental health issues and burnout, and rising inflation. We've also seen reports of a disturbing decline in public trust in the nonprofit sector and a continuing reckoning of nonprofits and charities to embrace diversity and inclusion from leadership all the way to frontline workers. To help us understand the challenges and explore solutions, please welcome Zahra Esmail. Zahra is the CEO of Vantage Point, a nonprofit organization that focuses on strengthening the capacity of nonprofits across BC. Zahra has worked in the nonprofit sector for over 15 years with experience in international development, housing and homelessness, community development, youth engagement and entrepreneurship, fundraising, and microfinance. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Mary. I'm happy to be here.
Well, as we mentioned in the introduction, Canada Helps Giving Report released earlier this year really showed a very stark situation for nonprofits nationally, who are facing higher demand for service, lower funding, rising inflation, staff turnover and burnout, and crippling lack of volunteers. What's the data telling us about how nonprofits are faring in BC?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to the conversation today. As you mentioned, my name is Zahra Esmail. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I want to acknowledge I'm joining from the unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations from my home office today, and delighted to be here for this really important conversation. So my organization, Vantage Point, has been involved in trying to compile data from the nonprofit sector in BC for several years. Earlier in 2023, we released the safety net report, which outlined some of the challenges that nonprofits are experiencing in our province. We had about 750, a little bit more than that, respondents, and from that we were able to get some trends. Of course, this is only a small glimpse in the over 30,000 organizations in the province, but enough that we were able to sort of pull out some key trends, key things to keep paying attention to, which do match what was in that Canada Helps report. So overall, the organizations who responded reported that they're having to do more with less, that revenues are remaining stable, which is a good thing. And I think a lot of that had to do with government support in the early days of the pandemic, which have been able to spill over for a few years. But wages, benefits, and the costs of goods and services to deliver services are increasing. I think that's something every Canadian can relate to. The world is just more expensive now. And so with nonprofits providing essential services and community programming, with revenues remaining stable, it's been really hard for the sector to be able to meet those higher costs without an increased injection in funding. And sometimes that results in organizations having to make difficult decisions and pull back on some community outreach and programming. Another key trend in our province is that there's major looming HR concerns, not necessarily that dissimilar from some other major sectors who get a lot more attention than our sector does, but nonprofit leaders are preparing for changes as senior staff are retiring. There's been quite a big turnover of people who have been in leadership roles for a long time, and there's a little bit of a gap in terms of new people who are experienced and ready and also willing to take on those often very demanding roles. We know that wages and benefits are not high enough for people to meet the cost of inflation and living in big cities or rural regions across BC. So that's a big struggle.
One of the most alarming things coming out of the reports this year is the sharply rising demand in services that nonprofits and charities are facing, particularly since donations and funding are not keeping pace in most of the country. What are your thoughts on this very complex issue?
You know, when we did this latest round of research, we had to pick a title for the report. And the reason that we picked safety net is because I think that our sector has really showed up as a safety net for society and communities challenges for a long time. It goes back to the way that the nonprofit sector was created initially. It was to help people have access to what they need. Sometimes those services in other countries are provided directly by governments. Other times they're provided through religious institutions, many of which are part of the nonprofit sector as well. But that safety net that we provide for communities is essential. And that has to do not just with emergency services, but also with social connection and inclusion in community and people's sense of well-being and engagement and fullness. During the pandemic, I think we really recognized that the safety net was being put under pressure. The people were recognizing not only that there was a major crisis in terms of, for example, seniors accessing prescription, food security, that became a huge challenge during the pandemic, racial justice and people's need to learn and work through some trauma that was coming to the surface. There's so many things that are happening in the world right now, and oftentimes in the absence of another group to turn towards, people in community are turning towards nonprofits. But most of us, I think, as members of community, don't actually recognize that contribution. We don't give it much thought until and unless we need the services, and then we expect the services to be there. And so as times are tough and as people are feeling more in need of physical services or connection, the nonprofit sector's strength is essential in that. And I really believe that during the pandemic, when a lot of organizations or businesses had the privilege of packing up and going home and doing their work or not doing their work remotely, it was nonprofit folks, along with our medical workers and taxi drivers and other essential folks, who continue to go and serve community every single day, regardless of the risk on themselves or their families. And that moment in time, I think, created an understanding about how important and essential this sector is. So coming back to that word safety net, or that term, if this sector is the safety net for community, at this moment in time, we're needing a safety net of our own, so that we can continue to have that strength and resilience to be able to support community through good and bad times.
That's a really good way of putting it. Certainly, we saw the nonprofit sector really step up during the pandemic and really go above and beyond, much to the challenge of the very people that were on the front line and doing all that important work. I think in some ways, we sort of missed a lot of what we needed to do to become resilient in the future, including our relationship with young people. The Canada Helps Giving report calls on charities to create better relationships with young Canadians. Do you think the sector's doing a good job of engaging young people as donors and volunteers or staff? I mean, how are we doing, and could they improve?
Yes, I think we can improve. I think that there's efforts, but we could improve. A few things I want to say about that. Actually, I think the systems that nonprofits work within are quite dated. One of the things that we've been talking about a lot is administrative caps. So if a donation comes through, let's say there's a grant from a government body for $100,000, we're capped at being able to spend 10% of that, usually, sometimes less, sometimes slightly more, on administration or overhead. And not direct service. Oftentimes, volunteer engagement falls within that area of administration and overhead. So when organizations can't actually invest in better systems or better recognition or better outreach, the way in which we're able to innovate and pull in new people with a changing demographic is limited. So just by design, the sector is kind of cut off at the knees a little bit in terms of how to respond to and engage with young people and just more people in general. I think we need to do a better job with our relationship with media. There are so many beautiful contributions that our sector makes. And generally speaking, this is one of my frustrations. The only time you hear about nonprofits in the media is when there's a scandal. And it just sets public opinion back really far without building understanding about the complexities of what it means to run an organization. I'll actually share, I was recognized as one of the Business of Vancouver's Top 40 Under 40 a few years ago, and one of the few nonprofit folks that was involved in that. It meant a lot because nonprofits are business. We run very complex businesses and need a lot of financial acumen to be able to manage donations and grants and deferred revenue, and it's quite complex and complicated. And our ability to help people understand what we do and how we do it is lacking. And so I think a stronger relationship with media to get those stories and also just that awareness about what nonprofits go through and what could make it better is important. Coming back to your question more directly about young people, if we were able to articulate our value and our purpose and our impact more, I think a lot of young folks, from my understanding, are looking for opportunities to engage in ways that aligns with their values. And I don't think that there's many nonprofits who can't offer something great to young people now, but how are we able to actually pull in that relationship so that people can understand the impact and not get stuck in maybe a controversy that was in a headline a few years ago. So more capacity, more infrastructure, stronger infrastructure to be able to tell our stories, work with people, do outreach is important. On the staffing side, we've already talked about the cost of living and how tough it is for young folks. And we did hear, our team did a little bit of convening over the last few years called the Youth Network. And some of the key learnings were that young people often will not leave our sector because they don't love the work. They're passionate about the work, but if we can't offer competitive wages, people have to make difficult decisions and will go to a different sector where they can pay rent or buy a car or do the things that people want to do. And our sector really should be compensating people in a way that they can live a good life. And I think that's why some of the advocacy and the systems change work is important, because we shouldn't feel or present ourselves as a second-class sector when we are an essential sector.
No question. And that is certainly a relevant thing, especially now with all of us dealing with everything costing more these days. It makes it a much more difficult decision to choose to work in an organization that can't quite pay you enough to be able to sort of pay your bills and manage to keep your head above water. All of these issues that we've discussed, as well as those that are set out in the Giving Report, seem incredibly large for an organization or one board of directors or one executive director to take on all by themselves. Does the sector need to better models of collaboration to get through these difficult times? We certainly saw that during the pandemic, some organizations coming together to collaborate and cooperate in order to provide better services and increase their impact and actually just be able to share resources. How can organizations learn from that and do better work together?
Time, I think, is essential for relationships to build. And so when nonprofits, and I keep going back to the same point, I'm sorry about that, but when organizations are really stretched and strapped and are dictated to spend majority of their time on direct programming, it makes it hard to carve out that time to be able to understand who they could be working with better and lean into that collaboration, because so much of that involves trust building, which really just needs time. So, there's some systems pieces there that I won't belabor, but I think there's some really good examples of network type work, which Vantage Point is learning a lot about. We're in the early stages of developing it. We're convening, being the leader to convene a BC nonprofit network that would be driven by nonprofits across BC, but we're learning from folks at Ontario Nonprofit Network and impact organizations of Nova Scotia and Calgary Chamber Voluntary Organizations and Imagine Canada. And there are, I think, especially around the time of the pandemic, when there were recovery supports that were going to business and other areas, nonprofits were noticeably absent from recovery strategies until these groups that already had a bit of that connection with each other and trust built were able to go and start speaking up on behalf of organizations and saying, hello, we exist. What about us? We are very important. We need your attention too. And I think the fact that in BC that type of engagement and advocacy has led to some really positive results and some tangible results it's almost shifted a little, or it's provided a bit of a window into our sector being able to step away from that natural competitiveness that we have because of the way that our system is built, where we're constantly competing for grants and funding and sponsorships and donors, but really looking at how there is potential for us to step into a space of greater collective strength if we work together and identify our common goals and really band together to try to address some of those systemic pieces that are keeping us in a less than ideal position. So I have hope for it. And I think, subsector by subsector, I'm seeing this happen as well, in addition to regionally across BC.
That's encouraging, certainly. I mean, we know that BC in particular, as a province, has had some really exciting announcements recently with the inaugural BC Nonprofit Day and news of a new $60 million fund for nonprofits. Can you tell us more about these initiatives and whether they're helping BC nonprofits in particular weather the storms that we're seeing on our horizon right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way that the nonprofit community responded in the early days of the pandemic, Vantage Point worked with some other partners to do that first research. We had a paper that came out in 2020 and then another one in 2021 called No Immunity and Unraveling. And those really caught the attention of the current government. And so in part because it was one of the first times that we've come together and provided data on our sector, because I think that data can drive decision making, right? It can strengthen a position. So by providing that data to the government, they were able to understand what some immediate response should look like for our sector. And also, from what I understand, it contributed to the creation of the Parliamentary Secretary for Community Development and Nonprofits role, because it demonstrated that there was a gap in the way that a government was considering all of the different players that they work with or stakeholders. So the fact that that position exists now is definitely something that is encouraging, and I think also almost forcing the sector a little bit to think about how collectively we want to be working with that position, as opposed to pulling that role in 16 different directions because we're not coordinated in our efforts or our messaging or our desires. So that's a promising piece there. From what I understand, the research did drive the first, or it contributed very strongly to the first recovery and resiliency fund that the province offered last year. And that was specifically designed for smaller nonprofits who had budgets of under $1 million, who were really struggling because of the pandemic, a special focus on rural and remote and organizations serving equity-seeking communities or equity-serving communities. So there was a lot of what the surveys revealed about which organizations were most vulnerable was reflected in the response from the government with that first $30 million. The new investment that was announced recently for $60 million is called the Stronger Community Services Fund, and it'll have a couple of different streams to it. There'll be some additional funding for that initial recovery and resiliency grant that I just talked about. There'll also be a little bit of top-up support for level BIPOC grants, which are for Black, Indigenous, people of color-led nonprofits. And that's a previous grant stream that's existed already. And then there's two new streams as well, the Community Prosperity Fund, which is for community foundations across BC for them to support organizations in their community. And then something called the Lighthouse Organizations Fund, which is a fairly large chunk. And that's funding for large multi-service organizations with a provincial or regional footprint that support poverty reduction most directly. So it looks a little bit different from the first round. It's grown since then. It's doubled in size. And I think also through the first Recovery and Resiliency Fund, there was some learning about how that helped some organizations in immediate crisis, but how there's other organizations who are also providing essential services and who need to be included in such opportunities. In my opinion, and we can't, Vantage Point wasn't very involved in any of the development of the $60 million fund. I really have to give kudos to Vancouver Foundation for developing that relationship directly with the provincial partners that we have and advocating for the sector in that way. And I think that these are steps in the right direction. These are the first examples of this type of funding coming to our sector from the province. In my opinion, this is just the beginning. And I think that our sector does a lot and needs a lot more sustainable support. And so my hope is that this will continue to grow, and that we will be a worthwhile investment, similar to some of the other sectors that receive a lot of foundational support and consistent support from the province as well.
Well, certainly, those many funds and announcements of additional funding is quite distinct across Canada. Not every province has been able to do that. So another distinction is, as you mentioned, in British Columbia, there is a home and government, as it's called, in the nonprofit sector, with the Parliamentary Secretary for Community Development and Nonprofits actually embedded within the BC government. I'm curious as to how much you think this has helped the BC nonprofit sector advocate for policy and funding changes. It hasn't been a very long time, but it sounds like there's been some dramatic kind of announcements. Just how influential is that role in your province?
Yeah, I think that the role is extremely important for us, and we're being encouraged to work together in a different way, which I've already alluded to. I think it's very meaningful just that there is somebody within government that we can connect with to talk about what it is that we need. And we're at such an early stage as a province, really knowing how to liaise with our Parliamentary Secretary of Community Development and Nonprofits in a very meaningful way. But I think we are learning from partners in other provinces about what public policy advocacy can look like, how to engage the sector to understand what it is that nonprofits across BC have in common and collectively want from that role. One of the sensitivities I think that Vantage Point is trying to balance, we have some insights and some ideas about what is necessary. We know that if we go and start advocating based on what we think, we'll be doing on behalf of and not alongside the sector. And so for us, taking a pause and doing the important convening work so that different perspectives and organizations across different regions and from different subsectors can take the time to contribute to what future advocacy initiatives will look like is really important to build engagement, to build trust, and to be able to advocate for the sector in a more meaningful and authentic way. And so there's a little bit of a push-pull for us in terms of the urgency of going out and really working directly, and then also making sure that we're approaching this in a good way where there's space and room and inclusion. And so I think that basically, I don't know if I'm answering your question well, but I think over time, we will learn to engage with that role in a very, very powerful partnership. We're definitely celebrating the wins that have come our way as a sector, but I think definitely also trying not to put the cart before the horse in terms of how quickly we're moving into a space of action vis-a-vis that role, to make sure we're not doing that at the expense of building a movement that's really based on engagement and trust.
Now, I think you've alluded to this earlier, but I would like to sort of dig a little deeper. Vantage Point has been working this year on creating a provincial nonprofit sector network in British Columbia. Can you give us an update on where that's at and what people can expect to see in 2024?
Yeah, I'm happy to. It's very exciting work for us and I think for the sector. So, there have been initiatives to try to pull together this type of an advocacy group for the sector over many years. And it's a hard thing in a competitive space to pull folks together. And there's so much diversity in our sector, right? So any of that, it's not easy to do. When I joined the organization, Vantage Point had been working in sector development for a little while, but there wasn't a clear understanding of what the role was and what was appropriate and what was in scope and what was necessary, really. It was a little bit more ad hoc and responding to crises that were emerging and pieces like that. And so we looked at what was happening in other provinces. We saw that there were provincial networks that either existed or were emerging in other places, including in Nunavut and PEI. Those are some of the other emerging network regions alongside BC, which it's been great to work with them and learn a lot alongside them. But we identified a gap that BC doesn't have a provincial network. We have some really strong subsector associations, but we don't have any or entity that's pulling them all together to see what's common. And we don't actually have a group that is directly like kind of the go-to for the parliamentary secretary to understand sector-wide issues, right? But that's a gap that was identified. And so rather than just jumping in and filling that gap, we decided to step back and ask the community if this is something that was a problem that they felt needed addressing, if this felt like a good use of time, what kind of expectations they might have if we were to develop a network. Was Vantage Point the right convener, or was there somebody else who was better suited in the province to pull together an entity like this if the sector wanted it? So we did about 22 community conversations, some virtual, many virtual, some in person, and we went to different regions across the province to do those in-person engagements as well. And then we had a survey. So all in all, connected with over about 600 folks from various organizations across BC. And the resulting report is called Stronger Together. It's available on our website for anybody who wants to see it. But we learned that there is interest and cautious optimism about this type of an opportunity. I mean, many of us look up to ONN and the successes that Ontario Nonprofit Network has had, and the way that the visibility of the sector in Ontario has shifted through their leadership and engagement. And yeah, I'd say there's probably a little bit from my perspective of FOMO, like BC, we don't want to miss the boat here. There's obviously a growing movement across the country, and we have a unique perspective. And if we want to be heard at a national level, we need to do our work internally, provincially, to figure out how to represent ourselves, right? So I think that anyway, as a result of this feasibility study, there's a tentative green light to move ahead to start building the nonprofit network. What we did when we released the report, all the folks who came to the convening sessions, whose contact information we had, received a copy of the report. We also posted it on social media. It's on our website. We've tried over the last few months to do a lot of animation of the results of both the State of the Sector Safety Net report and the Stronger Together report through speaking engagements and other things. So we're really trying to bring the content to life so people understand sort of what we heard and what we're trying to do with it. So anyhow, the folks who received the report were able to sign up if they wanted to be involved in the next step. And so based on those respondents, we held a meeting last month to talk about what a governing sort of advisory body for this group should look like, for the network should look like. And we received lots of feedback about the different perspectives that should be there, and the type of representation that would be meaningful for a provincial network. So we're in the process now of drafting a terms of reference for an advisory group. We'll share that back with that group of folks who were kind of the early adopters in terms of being interested in helping us figure out the next steps. And then we will try to fill that advisory. We'll work with that advisory to really dig into the Stronger Together report in terms of the types of initiatives that the sector is looking for from a network, and to make decisions alongside that advisory about what a work plan should look like for the first 1 to 3 years, and then communicate that back to the sector and get feedback about if these are the right things to focus on. We could have taken what was in the Stronger Together report and just used our own judgment and said, well, this one's easy to do, this one we don't have money for, and just kind of done it. But again, keeping with these principles of community development, it's not our information, right? It's information that came to us from the sector. And so having more representatives from the sector help us understand it and prioritize what the network should do, I think is going to be a lot more meaningful, and hopefully create that openness and that trust and that engagement in a way that's going to help the network sustain and really be authentic, like I said earlier.
So I'd like to return back to the themes that we started with in terms of some of the highlights of the giving report that were rather stark. We're very interested in hearing your perspective as a leader from a regional perspective of what British Columbia's experience. From your perspective, what do you think is one of the most pressing issues nonprofit leaders need to be aware of in 2024? What's really keeping you up at night? And do you have any advice to address these issues?
Yeah, yes, I do. I think I think that the HR crisis is a big one. I think that the expectations of the workforce have changed. I think about, I'm not even, I mean, I guess I'm middle ages now. I'm in my early 40s. I don't feel like I'm that old. But when I think about when I started my career in the nonprofit sector, the level of sacrifice I was expected to make in order to follow my passion, to have a career in the sector was significant. And I don't think people should be put in a situation where they have to make those choices. And I don't believe that our younger workforce is either willing or able to make those similar sacrifices. And with our older workforce retiring and exiting the sector, if we don't find a way to compensate people and provide benefits and an ability for people to thrive in their lives, we are going to have a major workforce crisis. I don't think it's dissimilar with volunteerism either. You know, I think we need to find a better way to engage with the people. Our whole entire sector is people powered. And so if we're not able to pull in the people who have the passion and make sure that they can live good lives, our sector is going to be in big, big trouble. And the other piece that's really pressing for me right now, and particularly over the last week or two, is I think there needs to be a lot more support for organizational leaders, CEOs, executive directors, board chairs, to be able to navigate a really tricky landscape in the world right now. There's a lot of expectations and dialogue about equity, diversity, inclusion, justice, and how to actually live that in a way that is not going to make an organization vulnerable in a very polarized world is very difficult. There's a lot of divide in our communities. And I think organizational leaders, and like myself, are having trouble navigating that. And also doing that in a way where younger folks on the workforce who maybe join the nonprofit sector because of an alignment in values will feel that their values are being represented. It's quite hard when to speak, when not to speak, how to speak, how to use our leadership role in a way that's going to contribute to positive change and not just take up space, but actually lead to change, versus when to stay quiet and maintain or minimize reputational risk. These are pieces that are just, they're hard. And because there's so much division right now, it's not obvious or clear what a lot of leaders should be doing. And so I feel like that's something that needs time and attention so that our sector can contribute more to, or organizations like us anyway, can contribute more to building bridges and fostering dialogue rather than contributing to the already very, very polarized communities that we belong to.
Well said, and I couldn't agree more. Thank you, Zahra, for your insights and sage advice. It's so very appreciated by the nonprofit sector professionals in our audience. Thank you for joining us on CharityVillage Connects.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.